Welcome to this YSL DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series, we're going to talk about disconnected slicers and conditional formatting. So we'll begin by creating a basic disconnected slicer that allows the user to select. Talk about how to use a measure to return and compare the selected value with other values in your data model. We'll explain how you can change the measure to return a colour and then use that colour in conditional formatting properties. We'll also explain how you can deal with no selections and multiple selections in the slicer. We'll cover a couple of other examples working with text and date columns and explain the difference between direct and cross filters for the date example. And then finally, for a bit of fun at the end, we'll show you how you can use a slicer to allow the end user to pick the colour used in the conditional formatting. So let's get started. To get started, I've already imported our standard list of movies from an Excel workbook to create all these tables in the data model. As usual, if you want to follow along with the video, I'll drop a link in the description below that you can use to download this movies workbook, import all the tables from it, and then you'll be ready to follow along. For the basic report, I'd like to start with a simple table visual. So I'm going to insert one of those onto the report page, and then from my film table in the data panel, I'm going to insert the title field and the Oscar wins field. I don't want to aggregate the Oscar wins, so I'm going to change it from a sum to don't summarize using the menu in the columns bucket of the field well. I'll just resize and reposition the table slightly, and then maybe modify the font size a little bit to make it a bit more readable. And then that's the basic report set up. Next, I'd like to create a slicer which allows my end user to choose any of the values from the Oscar wins column. So let's insert a slicer visual into a blank part of the page, and then we can populate that using the Oscar wins column from the original film table. I'd rather not use a slider for this example, so I'm going to modify the formatting of this slicer using slicer settings and then set the style to a vertical list. Now at this point, your slicer will behave pretty much as you would expect any slicer to behave in Power BI. If I choose an item from this list, it will filter every other visual on the same page to highlight only the values matching the one that I've selected. So any other values get hidden completely. For this video, what I'd rather do with my slicers is not filter other items on the same page. I want to use this slicer as a picker that will then change the formatting of values in the other visuals. So I never want to hide any items. I don't want to filter my table. If I choose the number 0 here from this list, all the values matching the one that I've picked, all the zeros in this list, will be formatted in some way. Maybe we'll change the font color, for example. If I want that to work, I can't populate this slicer with the same field, which is being displayed in the table visual. The two are, of course, tied together. If I choose an item from this slicer, it's the same field that's being presented in the table, so inevitably it filters the results. What we need to do is create a separate table containing a list of the values I'd like to select, and then use that disconnected table to populate this slicer. Now there are several ways we can do that. Perhaps a simple way to get started would be to calculate a list of Oscar wins values by selecting the unique distinct values from the original Oscar wins column. So to do that, let's head up to the Modeling tab in the ribbon, and then we can click the New Table option, which will give us the formula bar in which we can write some DAX to calculate a new table. I'm going to change the name of my table, let's call it Oscar Picker, and then let's make it equal to the result of the values function. So the values function allows you to reference a column. In this case, it's going to be the Oscar wins. And then it simply returns a list of unique values from that column. So if I hit enter, I'm going to get a new calculated table displayed in my data panel. If I have a look at the table view on the left-hand side, I can see that that table contains a single column with one row for each unique Oscar wins value. And the really important thing is if I switch to my model view, this Oscar Picker table that's being created has no relationship whatsoever to anything else in the data model. So that means selecting items from this Oscar wins column can't propagate any filters to any other tables, so it can be used just to select values. So heading back to my report view, I can take my slicer, I can remove the original Oscar wins column from it, head over to my Oscar Picker table, and add my new Oscar wins column to my slicer. And that means that if I choose items from this slicer now, it has no influence whatsoever on any other visuals on the page. It's a disconnected slicer. The next thing I want to do is create a measure which calculates the colour that we're going to apply to the font of the Oscar wins column in this table. And the first step in doing that is to establish whether the value for the Oscar wins for each filter context in this table matches the one that I picked in this slicer. So if I pick the number 1, for instance, it should be able to detect that the value for 2001: A Space Odyssey matches the one that I picked. So let's start creating a measure that's going to do that for us. Let's right click on the All Measures table in the data panel and then choose New Measure. And I'm going to call this one Oscar Wins Color. So the basic logical test that I need to perform is to pick up on the value of Oscar wins for the original film table and compare it with the Oscar wins for the Oscar picker table. To do that, I'm going to use the selected value function. If you remember from a previous video, selected value is a combination of if has one value values. So it's a nice shorthand way of writing that combination of functions. So I'm going to refer to the Oscar wins column of my original film table. So that's detecting the Oscar wins value for each one of these filter contexts. And I'm going to check if that is equal to the selected value for my Oscar wins column in the Oscar picker table. This is, of course, just the basic logical test. If I hit enter here and then just place this temporarily in my table visual, we should be able to see simply the value true or false next to each row. So true when it matches the value I picked and false otherwise. As I change the value I've got selected, we'll see the position of the trues and falses changes. Now we need to translate the list of true and false values into valid colours. And to calculate a colour in DAX, you simply need to produce a string which represents either the name of a colour or its equivalent hexadecimal code. If you want to know what valid colour names you can use, have a quick search for web colours. Here's the Wikipedia article on the subject. So any of the beautiful flowery names of colours in this table here, you can use in your DAX expressions. You'll see the hexadecimal codes for each of these named colours in the second column of this table as well. You can produce far more colours using hex codes than you can from just the names. So if you have unique sort of corporate brand colours you need to produce, you're more likely going to use the hexadecimal code instead. I'm going to produce, let's go for a simple one. I'm going to produce orange for the colour if my Oscar wins value for the film matches the one that I picked from my slicer. So to make that work, let's head back to the report. I'm going to choose my Oscar wins colour measure, and I'm going to wrap this logical test up in an if function so that I can produce different results based on the result of that logical test. So if that is true, I'll stick a comma at the end. I want to produce the colour orange as a string, followed by a comma, and if it's not true, I'll just produce the bog standard colour black. So that's the colour that my text already is, of course. So if I close the round brackets there and hit enter, we'll see that the list of true falses now shows either black or orange. And to actually make use of that to apply some conditional formatting, I can head to my table visual, find the Oscar wins column, apply some conditional formatting to it. I'll change the font color in this example, and then change the change the style of conditional format from a gradient to a field value. And then from the drop-down list, simply pick my Oscar wins color measure. When I click OK, we'll see now that the Oscar wins value changes its color according to the value I've selected in my disconnected slicer. Finally, I can just tidy up my table visual by getting rid of the Oscar wins color column. It's not necessary to see that, it was just for illustration purposes. So now the system works according to the value that I picked. One small problem we have with the way this system works at the moment is that if the user wants to highlight nothing in the table, you might expect to just be able to unselect all of the options in the slicer. But unfortunately, that doesn't quite work the way you might expect. If I clear out all of the options, you can still see that the Oscar wins of zeros are still highlighted in this table. And it didn't matter which one I previously had selected, by the way. If I choose number 1 and then clear this slice of selections, it reverts to highlighting the zeros. This is to do with a combination of two things. First of all, if I look at my Oscar wins color measure, I've used the selected value function to pick up on the value of Oscar wins in the Oscar picker. Selected value, as I mentioned, is a combination of if has one value values. So if I have only one value in the slicer selected, the selected value function will return that selected value. Otherwise, it returns blank. So that's part one of the problem. And the second part of the problem is that when you compare zeros with blanks, by default, Power BI DAX considers that to be true. So 0 equals blank. So it highlights all the zeros, even though I've got essentially a blank being returned from that slicer. So what can we do about that? Well, a fairly simple solution would be to make use of the extra optional parameter of selected value. If I don't have only one item selected, so at the moment I effectively have all 12 options selected in this list, if I don't have a single one of those selected, I can use the second parameter of selected value to return an alternate result. If I type in a comma still inside the round brackets here, maybe I'll just zoom out a little bit more so we can see this. So all on one line, so I've got my alternate result parameter available. I'm going to enter a value that can't possibly appear next to any of my Oscar wins, any of my films. I'll use -1 as my alternate result. So I'll return the Oscar wins that I've picked if I've picked only one, and -1 if I don't have one selected. So having done that, if I update my measure now, we'll see that when I don't have any items selected, it's trying to highlight all of the films with -1 Oscars. If I do pick 0, that's still highlighted, and then I can subsequently select any of the other individual values and have that work correctly. Using the second parameter of the selected value function does introduce another problem to this system. What if I wanted to highlight more than one Oscar wins value in my table? I can of course select more than one item in my slicer by holding down the control key and clicking on multiple items. But you'll see that as soon as I introduce a second option in my selection, nothing now is highlighted. Because of course, I've used selected value, which tries to return a single selected value from this column. If I don't have just a single item selected, I'm now returning -1. So this isn't particularly useful. What I could do to change this is actually abandon the use of the selected value function altogether. Rather than checking if each individual film's Oscar wins is equal to that single option, I could replace selected value with the values function. So remember, this is the function we used to create our original Oscar picker table in the first place. Now, the values function doesn't have a second parameter. You simply refer to a single column of values. And what the job of the values function is to do is to return all of the items, or at least all of the unique, distinct items in the column. We then finally just need to change the way we're comparing these two lists. Rather than checking if a single value of Oscar wins is equal to all of the values we've returned, we need to check if the single value of Oscar wins is in the list of Oscar wins we've returned. So having done that, if I update my measure now, we'll see that when I have more than one item selected, all of those are highlighted. And I can pick more and more items to highlight as many as I want. Now that I've allowed multiple selections in my disconnected slicer, I've got one final problem I think I need to solve. If I clear all the selections from the slicer, technically I've got everything selected, so now every single row is highlighted. I kind of want the opposite, don't I? If I have everything chosen, or effectively nothing specifically selected, I don't want to highlight anything. So one way we could solve that is if we head back to the Oscar wins color measure, we could wrap another if function around this logic. So I'm going to say if, and I only want to highlight things in this table if I have filtered the Oscar picker Oscar wins column. So I'm going to use the isFiltered function to determine whether that's happened or not. So I'm going to say if isFiltered, Oscar picker Oscar wins. Then I'd like to check if the items I have selected match the individual Oscar wins for each film. And if so, I'll highlight the text in orange, otherwise it'll be black. And then finally, just right at the end, I want to say that if I haven't filtered the Oscar picker Oscar wins, I want all the text to be black. So there's the full set of slightly clunky logic to make that work. But if I hit enter at that point, you'll see that when I have no specific selection, i.e. all of the Oscar wins values are picked, they're not filtered, the font color is black. If I choose a single item from my list, it highlights that single item. If I choose multiple items from the list, it will highlight those multiple items as well. It's probably worthwhile quickly mentioning that now we have the measure set up this way, we can use a slider to allow the user to pick a range of values rather than a list of individual separate ones. So I'm just going to modify my slicer so that it goes back to being a between style, which will automatically generate this slider type slicer. Just make that a bit wider than tall. When I don't have any selections made, any explicit selections, of course, I have nothing highlighted, but if I drag the bottom and top end of my slicer now, it will highlight anything which falls between the selected values. So if you prefer to allow your user to control the selection that way, then you can use that sort of nice slider type control instead. The same techniques we've just used here for a numeric field work equally well for a text field. So for the next example, let's say we wanted to insert into our table visual the genre that each film belongs to. So I'm going to go to the genre table in the data panel and insert the genre field. Now I'd like to be able to select any of the individual genres in a slicer and have any matching genres highlighted in this list. So the same basic process is what we need. We need to create a separate disconnected table that allows us to pick the individual genres. Let's do that first. We can head over to the Modeling tab in the ribbon, choose New Table, and I'm going to call this one Genre Picker. And then again, we're going to use the Values function to return a list of unique values from the original genre column of the genre table. Once we've done that, we can hit Enter, and we have our new Genre Picker table. If I look in the table view, it's got a single column containing the list of genre names, and in the data model, a new disconnected table with no relationships to anything else in the model whatsoever. Having done that, I can head back to the report view, and I can insert a new slicer onto the page. And then slicer, I can assign the genre column from my genre picker table. So the important thing about this is that if I pick items from this list, it has no influence yet whatsoever on any other visuals on the page. Now I can create a new measure that works out whether the genre for each individual filter context in the table visual is equal to, or at least in, the list of genres that I've picked in my genre slicer. So to do that, let's add a new measure to the All Measures table. I'm going to call this one Genre Color, and I'm going to make it equal to the same sort of combination of functions we used in the previous example. So first of all, I'm going to check if isFiltered Genre Picker genre. So I'm going to establish whether I've selected anything or not from that slicer. If I have, then I want to check if the selected value for the original genre column, so genre, is in the list of values I've selected from my genre picker genre. Is true, I want to produce a color. I'll go for orange again, why not? We'll just keep it consistent for now. Otherwise, I'll produce black as the color. And then finally, if I haven't filtered the genre picker at all, I also want to produce a black color for the font. So the pattern is identical to that we used for the Oscar wins color. If I hit enter to create that new measure, I can then head over to the table visual. I can apply the color to any of the columns, but I guess it makes sense to apply it to the genre column. So let's apply some conditional formatting to the font color of the genre column. And again, we'll use a field value and then select the genre color field. So if I click OK at that point, I don't yet have anything selected in the list, so I should not see anything highlighted yet. If I pick a single genre, it should highlight all the films with that genre. If I pick multiple genres, all of those should be highlighted as well. You can use the exact same technique with date fields in your data model as well. To demonstrate that, let's head over to the film table visual, and I'm going to insert the release date field from the film table into it. Because I'm using the automatic calendar tables of Power BI, I get not the actual release date, but the date hierarchy inserted, so I get the separate year, quarter, month, and day. And for this example, I'd like to change that so it shows the actual date. So I'm going to change the release date field in the columns bucket in the field well from using the date hierarchy to using the release date instead. Now what we need to do is create a disconnected table which will allow me to select any of the dates which appear in this list. I could do that again using the values function. If you remember the videos we've covered previously on custom calendars, you could use the calendar function as well, or the calendar auto function if you prefer. I'm not going to go back and revisit those right now, so I'm just going to go with the same sort of technique we've used so far. We'll use the values function to produce a new table called date picker. So from the modeling tab, new table, I'm going to call it date picker, and then make that equal to values, and then refer to the release date field of my film table. Once I've done that, we can hopefully see we've got a new date picker table with a single column called release date. If we look in the table view, we can see a list of the individual dates appearing that exist in the release date column. And in the data model, once again, my date picker isn't related to anything else at all, so it won't propagate any filters when we select an item from it. Now again, because I'm using the built-in automatic calendar table feature of Power BI, having created a new column of dates, Power BI has created for me a hidden calendar attached to that date. So I've got a bit more variety available. I've got a hidden hierarchy for those dates that I can use to populate my slices with, which I'll do shortly. I want to create a basic slicer though, first of all, like a slider type tool that allows me to pick any of the date ranges. So I'm going to just maybe adjust the position of my genre slicer first, and then I'm going to insert a new slicer. If only it had occupied the space I'd left for it. And then in that new slicer, I'm going to insert the release date field from my date picker. So I get a nice slider tool representing the full range of dates from the earliest to the latest film in the database. And I can happily change the selection there without filtering anything in my table visual. Now, setting up the color to highlight the dates which match the ones I've selected in the slicer is identical to the two techniques we've used for our number and text fields. In fact, they're so similar, I'm not even going to bother writing this out again from scratch. I'm going to go back to my genre color measure, and I'm just going to highlight and copy all of the code from there before I create a new measure and then paste all of that copied code in. I'll change the name of the measure so it's called the date color. And then it's simply a case of modifying the columns I'm referencing. So I'm first of all going to check if I have filtered my date picker release date. And if so, I want to check if the selected value of the release date from the film table is in the list of values I've selected from the release date in the date picker. So exactly the same set of logic used for the previous two examples. If I enter that measure, and then I head back to my table visual, I find my release date field, and I choose to apply some conditional formatting. I'll go for the font color again, and then from the drop-down list, choose field value, and then from all measures, choose the date color measure. So at the moment, if I make sure that I've cleared the filter, I didn't quite have the slicer filter cleared, you can see that nothing is highlighted. But as soon as I reduce the date range, we'll see that I highlight only dates which fall between that range. So that date slicer is currently working in pretty much the same way as our Oscar wins slicer is working. We can select from a range of dates and highlight everything which falls in that range. But our release date column in the date picker, because of the automatic built-in calendar system of Power BI that I'm using, I've got a lot more choice over how I can filter my dates. I'm going to change the way this slicer works. First of all, I'm going to resize it so it's more of a vertical slicer than a horizontal one. And then I'm going to change its style from to a vertical list. Now I don't just want to pick individual dates from that list. What I want to do is be able to pick individual years and maybe months within those years. So I'm going to remove the release date field from the slicer and then head to the date picker table in my data panel and expand the release date and then expand the date hierarchy. So these 4 columns, year, quarter, month, and day, are stored in a hidden calendar table that has a hidden relation to the release date field of my date picker table. So I can insert the year field and maybe insert the month field as well. And now I can choose either an entire year by ticking the box next to it, or I can choose from the drop-down list a single individual month in those years. Maybe I'll just change the sorting of this so it sorts in descending order so I can see the more recent years at the top of the list. Okay, so this is all set up, ready to go. Looks pretty good. Let's find a year that I can format or highlight. I've got 2014, I've got 2013. Let's try 2014 and 2013. Oh dear, that doesn't appear to be working quite as well as we expected. So I've got the option to choose years and months, but the problem is the way that I'm testing for whether this field is filtered, beg your pardon, whether this field, my release date picker, is filtered. If I have a look at my measure for date color, I'm using this function isFiltered date picker release date. The isFiltered function only detects direct filters applied to a column. So in order for this to return true, the filter must be applied by a column which exists in the same table as release date. As I've just mentioned, these 4 columns in the date hierarchy aren't stored in the same table. They're stored in a hidden calendar table. So if I want this system to work, I can't use the isFiltered function. I need to use the isCrossFiltered function. We've encountered this again in a previous video, but nice to see another example here. So I can now check whether the release date of my date picker is filtered by a column from another table. So in this case, it'll be the year and the month columns. And if I update my measure and have a look in the background, we can see if I have 2014 and 2013 selected, it highlights those films released in those years. So I can narrow that down again to an individual month and an individual year. So I go for, let's see, 2014 June. It'll highlight anything made in June. And then maybe I can highlight February as well. So I've got a lot more choice basically with my date picker. So for every example we've created so far in this video, we've used the same hard-coded constant color of orange to highlight the examples that we select in our disconnected slicers. For the final part, just for a little bit of fun, we're going to let the end user decide which color to use. And in order to make that work, we're going to import a table of colors that the user can select from. I'm going to import this from an Excel workbook. So from the Home tab in the ribbon, choose Excel Workbook. And another one of the files you can download from the link in the video description is called Colors. If I just double click to open that up or connect to it, there's a single worksheet in there called Colors. And there are the 3 column names. The color ID isn't actually that important. We can ignore that. But the color name is what the end user is going to see and select from. So that includes things like nicely named Wise Owl Orange and Wise Owl Brown. And then a second column called Color, which contains the actual web color name or the hexadecimal code for that color instead. So the end user won't see that one, they'll just pick from the color name. I'm going to load that table into my data model. Should be fairly quick, and there's my colors table imported. Again, the important thing here is that it shouldn't have any connection to anything else in the data model, and of course, why would it? It is not related to anything. I've just imported it from fresh. So it's another disconnected table from which we can create another disconnected slicer. So back in the report view, I should have hopefully just enough space up at the top here to insert a slicer. I'll force it into that gap, even if it won't go in there automatically. And then I'm going to populate that with the color name field. I'd rather not see that as a vertical list. I want that to be shown as a set of tiles. So I'm going to go to the Format panel, choose Slicer Settings, and then set that to a tile. Maybe I'll also, just while I'm here, switch off the slicer header to give myself a bit more space. So there we go. We can see the individual items we can click on to select our colors. Final step is just to modify each of the other color measures, not to use the value orange, but to use the value of the color column from whichever color I've selected in this slicer. So let's head over to let's go to the date color measure first of all, and where we've got the value orange there, let's modify that to use the selected value function. So we'll say selected value, and then I'm going to go for colors color. And I want to make sure that the user can't select multiple colors, or at least if they do select multiple colors, we use a default color. So let's type in a comma there. What's a good default color? Let's go for black for the default color. Why not? It's what we've used for the default for everything else. I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard because I'm going to be using that quite a lot, as you might imagine. And then if I just update that measure, we'll see that in the background there, if I pick different colors from my slicer, the value of the date column changes its color according to the one that I've picked. Okay, so I just need to then modify my genre color measure in the same way, take away the word orange and replace it with that selected value, colors color, update that measure, and then do the same thing for the Oscar wins color. Change orange to the measure, or sorry, the selected value function I've just created. Okay, so having done that, now all of the columns will change their highlighting color according to the one that I've picked from my slicer. And of course that will change if I pick different genres, if I pick different years, if I pick different slicer values, then everything will pick up on the colors I've selected. One slightly annoying thing for me about this slicer is that I don't have the ability to use conditional formatting to set the individual tile colors according to the value of the color in the table. So if I look at the measure, sorry, beg pardon, the slicer, and have a look in the Format Your Visual panel, in the Values section, I can manually change the background color of each individual tile, but I can't use conditional formatting to do that, which is a bit of a shame. So what we could do instead is we could, rather than use a slicer, use some other visual that does allow me to conditionally color the items. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the visualization panel. And with the slicer selected, I'm going to change this into a tree map. Now, don't worry, the fact that all the buttons have disappeared. I've set up the categories to show the color names, but I also need to provide some sort of value for the tree map to draw itself. So a simple thing to do is just to show a count of color names. So if I add color name into the value section, it gives me a count of color name, and because there's only one color for each color name, then I get evenly sized blocks of colors. Now, you can probably tell from looking at this that we're not using our colours just yet. This is using the standard theme colours to colour in each individual block. So the next step is to go to the Format Your Visual panel and then head to the Colours section and find the lovely Conditional Formatting tool, the little FX button there. If I click on that, I can then set the colour of each block to use a field value and use value of the colour. If I then click OK, we'll see now that the blocks are coloured in according to the actual colours we've used in our colour table. And then finally, if I start clicking on these items, we'll see that our table visual picks up on the colour that I've picked. Maybe just for a little bit more tidying up, I'm just going to modify the formatting of this, this table. I'm going to switch off the category labels, and then I'm going to head over to the general category and switch off the title, and then maybe make that a little bit narrower so it's just a little line of colours sitting up at the top, and the end user can easily pick. Not to worry about what the name of the colour is, they can see exactly what they're going to get just by clicking on a coloured block. So maybe that's a little bit too frivolous for these examples. Maybe you wouldn't employ that in the real world, but it's kind of an interesting thing to be able to do. And it's all again related to disconnected slicers or disconnected tables. So hope you've enjoyed that one. Thanks very much for watching as always, and we'll see you next time.